Hi. Have you ever met anyone who's died, gone to heaven, and come back to tell the story? Our guest today did exactly that. My name is Pete Santos, and I'd like to welcome Dean Braxton to the show.
Thank you. Yes.
I will be interviewing and asking Dean several questions about his exciting and inspiring experience of dying, going to heaven, and coming back to tell what happened. Hi, Dean Braxton.
Hi, how you doing?
And also we have today Will Gunn, who will be with us in the interview, and we're gonna have a great time. Do you mind if I call you Dean?
No, you can call me Dean.
Okay, do you mind if I call you Will?
Feel free to.
Okay, great. Will and Dean, here we go. I have to say, it's bittersweet to have you on the show today. On one hand, you died and went to heaven, so you're here.
Yeah.
On the second hand, you are here to talk to us and share with us about your experience.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you came back and you're here to tell us about it. Yeah, so it's great to have you here in Finland on TV7. And I know you're normally used to traveling and ministering with your wife, Marilyn. She's not here with us at this point, but we would like to give our love from Finland to her. And yeah, well, the whole experience is action-packed, so let's dive right into it. Death. Death is a serious matter for many. How did it feel to die, Dean?
That's a loaded question in itself. I have to go back, Pete, and literally think about how I thought I would die and how it would feel. And of course, like most people, I was afraid to die, you know, because every time I saw someone die, it didn't look like they were having a good experience at the time. Mm-hmm. And so even myself, I was afraid to die. Even the way I did die, you know that I had a kidney problem, and that kidney problem caused what we call a festus or infection in my bladder area. And when they literally went in, the medical people went in and busted up the stones, they pushed that infection into my bloodstream. Now, they gave me the right antibiotics, they thought, to take care of the infection.
Yes.
But I was that one that resisted that medication. And so no one went back to check to make sure that it did what it's supposed to do. And the reason I'm starting off that way, because the way I died is that infection went through my body, and the medical people call it sepsis. I became septic, and everything in my body started shutting down or dying. And the first thing to go was my lungs. They're the first thing to go. And that's how even they knew I had a problem, is because I was having a harder time breathing after the operation. And every breath I took got shorter and shorter and shorter. At the time, the people didn't know why, because no one really thought it was because of the infection going through my body. They thought it was something else altogether. But the reality of it, that infection was shutting down my lungs. Now, the reason I say that is because the one way I did not want to die is what we call suffocation. Okay. You know, it was the number one thing on top of my list. I'm born again, know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, you know, and I would, even after I became born again, I would go to the Lord and I would say to him, if I'm going to die, don't let it be suffocation. Mm-hmm. And I almost looked like I had a clockwork. Every quarter, every 3 months, I had to remind him, this is not the way I want to leave the planet, okay? And here I am experiencing that. And I thought for sure, because of the fear I had of dying just that way. You know, I was afraid of dying, period. But that was the top of the list. Yes. If I was going to die, let it be a different way altogether. Mm-hmm. But that was the top of the list. And here I am, my lungs are shutting down. And literally where I thought I would be panicking, I thought I'd be hysterical, I thought I'd freak out, all that type of stuff. Mm-hmm. When I realized I was dying, all of a sudden what rose up on the inside of me were these words. I'd never practiced them before. I never said them out loud, but it just rose up on the inside of me. And I felt like, because I was laying in the gurney, you know, the hospital bed and everything like that. I wasn't up standing around and walking or anything like that. You know, the medical people were rushing me really down the hallway because things were going bad really quick. And they were going to put me in what they call the intensive care unit. And to monitor me more and to try to stop me from going in that direction. But I felt like when I realized I was dying, I said these words. I said, I am dying. That's what I said. Just like I'm looking at you. Like, you know, like, I'm puzzled. Why am I dying? I just came in here for a kidney stone. You feel like you're dying, but you don't die. Right, you know? Right. And all of a sudden, what rose up were these words. I'm going home. Joy, peace, comfort came all over me. I was looking forward to leaving this body and going to be with the Father in Jesus. I didn't know that would happen to Christians. I did not know that when that moment came upon us, that we would really embrace it and have joy about it. And in the Bible, you know, there's a scripture that talks about that we would not experience what we call the sting of death. Yes. You know? Yes, yeah. And I never really understood that well until this time came. Because when that came on me, I didn't have the fear. I didn't have the panicking. I didn't have the, you could say, well, did you even feel the pain? It felt like I wasn't even going through no more pain. It felt that struggle I was having to try to breathe was not there any longer. It was like Jesus Christ had taken it. And yet in the Bible, can I read this scripture to you? I thought this was really good. I've read the Bible many times, and I read these scriptures many times. But what got me about this one is found in Hebrews, the second chapter. I'll get it for you because I want to read it to you and not try to quote it off the top of my head. It says this, Hebrews, the second chapter, the 9th verse, and this is out of the New English translation. It says, but we see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death. I love that part there. He suffered death so that by God's grace, he would experience death on behalf of everyone. And I always used to think that's just a spiritual death. And here I am going through this physical death and understand that really meant our physical death also. That when he got on that cross and he died my physical death so that I would not have to experience it. Is that good news? Is that good news?
Great news.
And if you read on in Hebrews, the second chapter, the 14th and 15th verse, listen to this. This is good. Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he, talking about Jesus, likewise shared in their humanity, so that through death he could destroy the one who holds the power of death. And I love the way it says here, that is the devil. It doesn't let you guess who it is. It tells you right off the bat, it's the devil. And then it says, and set free, boy. Do you hear that word? Set free. Those who were held in slavery and, bondage all their lives by what? Their fear of death. He took that fear. So when I was dying, you asked that loaded question. But when I was dying, I had no fear.
Right.
I was going home, and I was looking forward to it. And if Will, my brother here, was there, I tell people this all the time. It's kind of funny joking about it. But if Will was there and he was going to come and lay hands on me, you know how we Christians are. Yeah. And I'm not telling people not to go out and lay hands on people that are sick or that are going through this. But if he was, I'm going to start fighting him off because I knew I was going, Will. I was going home, and I wasn't going to let anyone stop me from going home. I always tell people the pull is strong. You know what I mean? The pull to be with the Father and Jesus in heaven is strong. And when you're at that moment, it gets even stronger. It's like a magnet pulling metal toward it, so. But that's what it was like. And I really believe that happens to each and every one of us. And I've heard stories since this has happened. People seeing their loved ones leave, and they're saying they left with a smile, or they had joy, or they, even to the point, I've heard these stories several times, not just one time, where people said, they could smell a fragrance in the room, like a bunch of flowers, I had one lady said that she smelled it, and her mom had left the planet or died because of cancer. And they were trying to figure out where the smell came from. And they went up to kiss her, and it was coming out of her mouth.
Wow.
So you asked that question? Us that are born again, know Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior, have the Holy Spirit on the inside of us, it's going to be a joyful time for us. Wow. That doesn't mean the other people are not going to grieve and miss us, but it's going to be joyful for us.
Okay. That's great news. Great news to all the viewers out there. Great news. Anything else you like to share about that?
Well, that's mainly the thing. The other thing that I found out about it, and I didn't know this, is really it's not the body dies, this flesh dies. Literally what it is the spirit leaves, the man on the inside of me, the real person I am. You know, it's that old saying, we're not a body, you know, with just a spirit on the inside, we're a spirit with a body on the outside. That's what we really are.
Yes.
And so the spirit leaves and then the body dies.
Yes.
And I found that in the scriptures also. You that listen to your Bible or read your Bible, and they found in James, the second chapter, the 26th verse, it says, faith without works is dead, just like the body is dead without the spirit. That means the spirit has to leave first, and then the body dies. And to help people even cross that bridge a little bit more, Will, what I usually tell people is you go to Genesis, the second chapter. When God creates Adam, what does he have to do? He has to, put a spirit, breathe in him, and then he becomes a living soul.
Yes.
You know what I mean? This body cannot live without the spirit, but the spirit can live without the body. Is that good news?
Amen. Amen.
So when people say, sometimes they say, what it was like to die? I said, I can't tell you, I wasn't there. I left my body and then my body died.
Wow.
And I get to comfort people that have had a loved one lost in some terrible accident. They're born again, they know Jesus Christ, they left first and then the accident took place. They weren't even there. And I've heard people say, well, I saw them breathe their last. I say, what you saw was their body struggling without their spirit. Their spirit had left beforehand, and now you're seeing them like gasoline. You know how you have a car that runs out of gas?
Yeah.
You know? Is that what they call it here in Finland too? Gas too? Or
Gasoline, petrol.
Petrol. I got to make sure I say it right. And so, when it runs out, it'll sputter still.
Right.
And many times what they're seeing that person do sputter because the spirit's gone. They say, I saw them breathe their last. No, you saw their body sputtering without them in it. Is that good news?
That's great news.
You know, now I do get to tell people this isn't offered to everybody. This is offered to those that know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. You know, and people say, well, how do you know? You'll find out. That's what I tell people all the time. But Jesus said he came that we have life more abundantly.
Yes.
When he said that God said, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believeth him shall have what? Everlasting life.
Yes.
It's given to us that have the life already. Because if you don't have this, you're going to go through the sting of death. You're going to go through the pain. You're going to go through all that. But if you have Jesus Christ, you're going to leave that body. That body's going to suffer, but you're not going to suffer. Is that good news?
That's great news.
Then you said something that's kind of interesting to me, and that is you described this contrast between, on one hand, I'm dying, and then on the other hand, this joy that you're experiencing. But that's not what we see in the movies.
Yeah,
you know, it's a different experience altogether.
Yeah, and that's what my concept was. You know, Pete and Will, was I had seen death from what I seen in the movies, because I hadn't seen a lot of people die in my life, and some people, you know, I went to the funerals, but there was very few, and I never was really in the room when anybody, you know, expired or left the planet, as I call it.
Yeah.
But I saw it on TV, and on TV, you see how they die on TV. You know, they looking like they're going through some pain and things like that. But us that are born again, know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, we won't go through that. And someone says, well, I don't know if I believe that or not. That's okay. You born again, you still get it.
Right.
It's not on your belief system. It's on what he did.
Right.
You know.
Right.
And I. What did you do to prepare? Well, I accepted Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. You know, but I was really accepting him to have eternal life, not to not have to go through death. Do you understand what I'm talking about?
Yes.
But the package comes with you not having to go through death.
Right. Right.
Yeah, you get the eternal life.
That's great news.
But you also don't get the sting of death. Is that good news?
Yes, great news.
I get excited about it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And okay, so when you died, were you thinking about your wife? Were you thinking about your kids, work? You weren't thinking about pain, but were you thinking about anything else?
You know, that's really interesting. You're the first one to really ask me during that moment of knowing I was dying, was I thinking about that? I was so overwhelmed by the joy and the peace and the comfort I was having. That was not a part of my thinking at the time. Didn't mean I didn't love them, didn't mean I didn't care for them or anything like that. But the reality of it is I was just thinking, I'm going home. That's the main thing that really was rising up inside me. I get to go home. You know, that's what it was going on. So I didn't think about my wife or my kids or anything like that at that moment. I know people that have gone through this, and sometimes they will linger on thinking about their wife or thinking about their kids until someone says it's all right to leave. You ever seen that where someone says that and then they leave, okay? I didn't have that luxury because this came upon me suddenly. It wasn't like I had 6 months to think about it or, you know, a week to think about it. It hit me all of a sudden. So I didn't think about that at the moment. I was thinking, I get to go home, you know, and that was the main thing that was for me. Now, I could tell you when I got there, I thought about him. When I got to heaven, I thought about my family greatly. But I'll tell you how I was thinking. You come here, where everything is right. There's nothing wrong. You know what I mean? We'll never, ever, ever, ever be separated ever again. That's what I was thinking when I was there. I wanted everyone in my family that I had known, you know what I mean, to be with me forever.
And we will get to that more in detail. Yes. Okay. So at what point did you realize you died?
You know, at what point did I realize it? When I came back to the planet.
Okay.
You know, because I left my body. And like I said, you don't die. The consciousness I had was more vivid than ever before. I was so free when I left this body. And I didn't know how much this body really restrains us, you know, and how it battles us more than we realize in a lot of things, okay? So when I came back to the planet, I knew, or came back into my body, I knew I had left my body, or what we call death. I knew it. It wasn't like I looked back when I left, okay? I knew I left, but I didn't look back and say, oh, there's my body down there in that bed, that type of thing. I just left, you know. It was too bad for the body. It was going to stay here. So really when I came back, I knew that, yeah, I had died. And I remember thinking, so it said, you had a near-death experience. I said, nah, it was no near-death to it. I was dead. Yes. My body was dead, you know. And so I knew that, and I could never, ever say that I didn't die. You know, my wife one time wanted me to say, well, say it was, I know. I said to her, I said, I died. According to what we know as human beings, this body was dead for 1 hour and 45 minutes. That means there was no oxygen in it, no blood going through it. I was what you call clinically dead for that long. You know that that's medically documented, you know, because I got the medical record. You've heard the doctor, Dr. Rigay, that was actually in the room, the doctor at the time, and he says I was really, really dead for a long time. So all that, I always tell people I can prove I died. That's the easy part. You can say I didn't go to heaven, but you can't say I didn't die. And the time was 1 hour and 45 minutes.
Okay. You know, it's interesting that you didn't even think about it or realize it until you came back, because you hear about different death experiences where people say they're on the top of the operating room and they're looking down on everyone and they have a perspective of the death. But that's great news that it's not even, you're not even thinking about that.
Yeah. I've heard those stories too, that some of the people have told me that. You know, I probably have helped people to have more clarity and sharing how I've shared with them what they experienced. You know, a good friend of mine one time was telling me about how he drowned and how his brother saved him. And as he's telling me like he was looking at it. And I said, do you realize how you're telling me this? And he said, what do you mean? I said, you're telling me the details of how your brother saved you, but you drowned. How could you tell from the position you're telling in unless you were out of your body at the moment?
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? That's what I said to him. So he's telling me how he drowned, and he's telling how his brother jumped in and pulled him out on shore. It was at a lake, and how his brother was getting it back. And he's telling me all the details. And I'm thinking, how can you tell me all those details unless you were not in the body and you were looking down on it? He was a young kid at the time, you know, when this happened to him. But it was interesting. So I've heard those type of stories. But when I left my body, I wasn't looking back. I was going to be with the Father and Jesus. You know, what was before me was a light. It looked like a window. It wasn't a window, but it looked like a window. I think it's the same description you get from people that say they saw the light at the end of the tunnel. Okay? I'm just saying it looked like a window. And I can remember going toward that light. I knew that's where the Father and Jesus is, and I wanted to be with them. Everything inside of me was pulling me in that direction, and I wanted to be with them. And so I could just tell you from that, point of view, in the sense of, of this body experience of leaving my body, I just didn't look back. I didn't care. I didn't care. You could have the body. I had one person one time come up to me and say, I want to touch the man that went to heaven. And said they went, and I said, well, the next time I leave, I kind of like put my hand out and took their hand like this. I said, the next time I leave, I'll send you this body. You can, because I said it didn't go. I'll put it in a box, and in my head I'm thinking of a casket, a nice casket. Yeah. I'll even pay for the casket so it looks really good. So, so when they get it in their front door, we have those deliveries like we have what was it, Amazon, delivered. I wonder if they'll deliver it for me.
It's interesting because in Ecclesiastes it talks about the chain and the silver bowl.
I know, yeah.
So it makes sense that when people, their chain has not been severed, so when they're out of the body, they're looking down. And when your chain is severed, that's when you start to ascend.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that before. I can't really tell you because I went. And some people say they go to the veil and they stop. I didn't go to the veil. I went inside. And so I experienced a lot more than some other people. Not saying their experience is not significant. I think if you touched eternity, once you're out of your body, you touch eternity.
Wow.
And you're never the same. That guy that I told you about that drowned, it helped him also clarify why he was the way he was. He was a risk taker. When he joined the Army, he was a point man.
Okay.
You know how in the Army, the point man's out there making sure the bombs ain't. And he said, I had no fear. The reason he had no fear because he had experienced what it was like to be outside his body. And he knew he knew he didn't die. He knew the body died, but he didn't die. Now, the whole thing about going to hell or going to heaven, I can't tell you where he was at that moment.
Yes.
But he said, Dean, that explains why I was the way I was. I always wanted to be in the most dangerous place because I knew I wouldn't get harmed.
Right. Dean, I want to go back to something that you said about this this moment of separation, and particularly about what you're saying about people that are released to die, say by family members, where you have someone that's lingering on, and then the family member saying, okay, you're free to depart.
Yes.
Can you comment on that, and what do you see is going on in such situations?
The only thing I could tell you is the thing that people tell me. I come in contact with a lot of people that go through this. I be asked to come to a lot of people that are getting ready to leave the planet.
Yes.
I didn't know that comes along with this, that I would be asked to come and talk to them before they leave the planet or die, as we call it, because of the experience I had. And the only thing I could tell you is people love people.
Yes.
They care for people. And that binding or that love, whether you realize it or not, connects us stronger than we could ever believe. And when it comes down to that time of you leaving the planet and you love someone so much and you don't want to hurt them, you're going to do everything you can to hang on. Yeah. And I've heard of people hanging on until somebody comes, like someone so far away, and they hang on. They're days they hang on until that person comes. And as soon as that person comes, they're glad they see them, and it's really for the person. Yeah. It's really not for them. It's really because they want that person to have that closure. Yeah. You understand what I mean? And so they'll hang on, and then at the last minute, when that person comes, they leave soon after. I call it leaving. Yes. I know we call it dying. I always say leaving the planet, So my vocabulary changed a whole lot in how I describe things, after I had this experience. But I think in that case, Will, that I think that love just binds people stronger than you realize, because you care for that other person so much, and you want them to have the closure that they want or something like that. It's not like you're trying to hold on. You're born again, you know where you're going.
Yes.
There's a peace that comes over you. I got to make sure that you're okay before I leave.
Thank you.
And that's what's really going on there. And then because the grieving part isn't the person that left. I wasn't grieving in heaven. I wasn't up there saying, oh man, I wish I was with my wife. I was with my man. But on the planet, people were grieving.
Yes.
Do you understand what I mean?
Absolutely.
And if we realize something, the five senses were meant to be eternal. I was meant to touch you forever. I was meant to see you forever. I was meant to hear you forever. I was meant to smell you forever. I was meant to taste you forever. So the five senses were not supposed to be cut off at all. So when a person leaves, like Peter, me and you, if all of a sudden we're cut off, all of a sudden what's grieving is not just my heart hurting, but my hand now can't touch you no longer. My eyes can't see you no longer.
Yes.
My ears can't hear you no longer. You know, my taste, you know, and when someone says taste, when you kiss your wife, you're tasting her. When you kiss your kids, you're tasting it. And there's a smell. Yes. Most of us don't realize we all have a smell.
Right.
I remember during the pandemic, I didn't get to see my grandchildren for a while. And then the first time I got to see them, my granddaughter came up to us and she hugged me and my wife and she said, "I love the smell of grandparents."
Yes.
Whether we realize it or not, well, we got a smell. Yes. Okay, grandparents got a smell, you know. He doesn't know nothing about that. Right. In time. But the reality of it, so when you're grieving, you're grieving. Your hand's grieving because it can't do this anymore. Do you understand what I mean? Yes. Your ears are grieving because it can't hear the voice anymore. Right. It's more than just the heart, you know. But the greatest thing, us that are born again, we have that hope that is talked about in Timothy, that we will see them again. When my father left the planet, my earthly father left this planet, I have that hope on the inside of me. I get to see him. I got brothers that don't know Christ. And when he left the planet, there was a sadness. And I'm thinking, man, what would it feel like to not have that hope? That you'll see them again. I don't know because I'll see my dad again. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. But they didn't have the same thing I had. And it was like cut off because all this is grieving.
That's a very interesting perspective. That's great to hear. Yeah.
I hope that answered your question.
It does. And you are, you know, I guess I would like to go deeper at some point, just talking about that difference between the death of a believer, the departure of a believer, and the departure of a non-believer. Yeah. I know you know about the believing part, but the other part I think is what oftentimes causes people a lot of angst about, you know, what's going to happen to such a person.
You know, and I try to really get it where people will, how do I put it? I'd say this, and this may be later on in the interview.
And we'll stop here and we'll continue in the next segment. Thank you for the interview with Dean Braxton, the man who died and went to heaven.
Thank you for watching this program, many of the programs on this TV7, because TV7 reaches so many places throughout the country, but also the world. And your support goes a long way in helping people to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. You know, I had the experience of dying and going to be with the Father and Jesus in heaven. I wouldn't have been able to have that if I didn't accept Jesus as Lord, but I had to first hear. This station of TV7 helps people to hear the gospel, to hear the good news. So you can look at the number down at the bottom of the screen, and you can support this station in whatever way you can to help people to come to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Again, thank you very much.